John, would you say this is a real sign of progress for China?
I think we've seen over the last couple of years, actually, really good signs of progress in sort of the media sector, the news sector. I mean, I think this is a natural disaster, as Anthony said, and I think the key here is that this is something that the Chinese government would never have been able to have hidden. The tremors were felt across the entire country, in fact, across most of East Asia. So the Chinese government, I think, straight away had to take a decision that they needed to be open about this, and that they needed to really allow camera crews in, and they needed to be frank, and they needed to show this for what it was, which is a tragedy. And that is a big change, certainly from 20 or 30 years ago, but it's also a change from only a few years ago, when floods, landslides, these sorts of types of natural disasters, where, you know, there wasn't a government that was at fault, there wasn't a party that was at fault, it was just a disaster, were still very restricted in the reporting that they could give. I mean, this is a government that doesn't like bad stories in the media about China. But I think particularly what we've seen through the media on Tibet over the last few months has really persuaded the Chinese government that they need to have a much more modern strategy for dealing with the media, and it needs to be about openness, and this is a really good example of that.
And so, John, whether China likes it or not, it is no longer in a position where it has the option even of behaving like the Burmese regime has behaved in the face of its natural disaster, correct?
Oh, that's definitely the case. I mean, I think although they're both authoritarian governments, and although China of 20 years ago is not dissimilar from the Burmese regime of today, they are now on very different paths. So the Chinese government is on a path which is all about integration, which is all about being open with the outside world, and that involves on the media side being open with its media, but also crucially it means allowing access for international aid, allowing access for help. And it's nowhere near as close country as it used to be, and it's nowhere near as close country as Burma still is. And so we don't have these problems of restrictions on visas, restrictions on aid and supplies. And of course the other issue here is that China is now a massively rich country, unlike Burma, and so actually it's able to meet most of the needs for the emergency supplies domestically. So it's not reliant on the UN, the US and others flying in large quantities.
If this disaster had not happened when the Olympic Games were only 3 months away now, do you think authorities would have reacted just the same in respect to how they've handled the media coverage of this?
I think I'm not sure that they would have done, no. And I think the lesson actually is a sense it's not the Olympic Games being in only a matter of a couple of months that's really changed them. It's what's happened in the previous month, which of course is absolutely tied to the Olympic Games. The protests around the torch, the reaction to the Tibet protests in particular, the way that they've demonized the Dalai Lama in the media. I think that the Chinese leadership has really learnt because of the incredibly bad handling that they did. I mean, they demonized the Dalai Lama, a man that's won the Nobel Peace Prize. They are basically accused of being a terrorist. It was the worst media own goal I think I've ever seen in my life. It was just awful, and it really was reminiscent of the old regime. We were back to language which was yeah, I mean, they were basically using Cold War language that we hadn't seen in Europe for 20 years, that obviously most of the rest of the world hadn't seen for decades, and it was just ridiculous. And I think they've now learned. And I had people from the Xinhua office coming to sort of talk to me and say, why are we getting this so wrong? Why can't you in the West see that the Dalai Lama is clearly stoking this rioting? And of course we're saying, well, no, he's not. You know, we have open media, we get a far more unbiased view, and in a sense you're kind of kidding yourselves. You're thinking you can deal with the media, the international media, the same way you do with your domestic media. And I think that that's a fundamental misunderstanding which they're really struggling to try and unwind. And I think we're seeing that they've sort of definitely taken a step forward. This is an easier situation for them. There's no demon here, there's no bad guy. I think the really interesting point will be if we actually start to see any evidence of government mishandling of this disaster. Because you will get stories of the disaster, you'll get stories of human tragedy stories, but will we actually see stories and hear of when the government fails to deliver aid in time, and perhaps, you know, that increases the death toll by small amounts, or will we hear, and that will be an interesting thing, because I don't think we'll hear that. I was just going to make a point that actually you've got a great diversity across this particular province, and you have really quite poor parts as well. Yeah. And I think the question here will be how quickly the emergency service will be able to access those poor parts, and then particularly how effective the reporting will be. Because in a sense, I mean, the Chinese government is still embarrassed about the level of development of China, that it's not been able to bring rural China up as quickly as coastal city China. Exactly. And I would be imagining that they would be quite sensitive about sort of poor villages being seen to have been effectively wiped off the map because of this. I mean, it's not a sign that the Chinese government wants to see, and again, I think that's where we'll see media manipulation.
You know, another change really to be observed in the behavior of Chinese officials and the government's handling of this disaster comes specifically with Premier Wen Jiabao, I would say. John, let me ask you, for the first time it seems we're seeing this almost Western-like diplomatic behavior by a Chinese official. Is that not true?
That's absolutely right. I mean, I think we have to be careful here, of course. He's a Chinese official, so he's not suddenly turned into a democratically elected leader. But in all my time of looking at China, he's the only senior Chinese leader who I've really thought, would actually be able to hold his weight in a democratic country. And that's because, in a sense, he's created this image of a leader of the people. Mao Zedong did this to a degree, other leaders have done it to a degree, but none of them have really ever authentically pulled it off. And this is a man that, on the day of the disaster, is seen flying to the site. We've seen him, on the site getting dirty, getting in, helping people. In previous disasters as well, this is an image he's created for himself and done very well. And in previous disasters, we've seen him in mine disasters, covered in soot, pulling people out of the ground. He's a hands-on leader, and that's the image he's trying to create. And it's an impressive image, and it's an image which I think Chinese leaders of the future are going to have if they're going to be able to maintain stability and control when we have crises like this. I think the whole thing we have to treat very much as a calculation that the Chinese government makes. I don't think that any of the lessons they'll have learned from Tibet or any of the actions which our governments are trying to do in order to sort of promote political reform there are actually going to fundamentally change China into a democratic country. That's not what we're talking about here. We have to operate, in a sense, almost within this virtual world that the Chinese leaders do. And I think everything we're doing, I mean, the human rights organisations, a lot of the pressure we're putting on, is in a sense to try and push that calculation and push that equation. So when I say that China has learned from Tibet, no, of course it hasn't learned that it needs to reach a genuine compromise with the Dalai Lama. It will forevermore try and maintain full control. But what it has learned is that it cannot just demonise the Dalai Lama, that it does have to make some small steps and make some very small compromises. And I think it's about working within that and actually trying to push that balance. And by doing that, I think our organisations play a key role in really putting on the pressure, changing the sides that China has to look at. And
right.
I think the difference here is, the difference here is that you have to try and open up these taboos.
And John, let me ask you if you think there's any chance that China's response, its generally positive management of this catastrophe, could help influence leaders in neighboring Burma, so that they actually learn a lesson in how... Go ahead.
It's optimistic, I have to say. I would like to think that would be the case, but... I mean, leaders in Burma are decades behind leaders in China, who are themselves still decades from really politically reforming. So I just can't see it happening. I mean, they've got a completely different set of circumstances they're working towards. They are effectively a completely closed-off country, unlike China. They don't have any of the requirements to have to have large-scale investment, media agencies present in their country, and they've effectively closed the country down. I mean, we've seen the visas haven't been allowed for basic aid workers because, of course, they're presumably scared that journalists or other people will sneak in and start reporting or start doing what the government doesn't want them to be doing. And I think we're a long way away from that. I mean, it's an optimistic thought, and I would like to think that that's happening. And, of course, one of the things that China's leaders do say is that, don't isolate the bad governance people, don't isolate the regimes. Let us talk to them, let us share our experience with them. And I think there's an element of helpfulness in that, but only an element.
Let me tell you a story which is very funny.